What I'm going to do today is talk about adventures of a spacecrafter. And what I mean by a spacecrafter, I've had a very fortunate career, and I just retired last fall. And I'm just an end-to-end space geek crazy person. And I've been very fortunate to make space exploration my career, my avocation, and my hobby. So there's like three elements. I do other things. I do a little fly fishing and a little art, but everything I'm passionate about is space exploration. And so I've been lucky enough to have a career in spacecraft engineering and explaining to people why space is important, the advocacy part that Philip mentioned with the organization. And I also I am a craftsman of sorts. I build miniatures of spacecraft. So there's these three elements. And so the angle for this group is how you can take your career and your passion and parlay it into your career, into your hobbies, and into your public outreach. So that's what you're going to hear about tonight. And it'll be an example of me because that's the person I know about best. And hopefully you'll find it interesting. So here we go. So it's an example of, what you can do, what you might be able to do. And again, I've just kind of gone through this: engineer, outreach, and a hobbyist. And that's what I mean by spacecrafter. You know, as an engineer, I work on spacecraft. As a model builder, I use my craft. So a little overview. I started out, one of the other groups besides National Space Study is an engineering society called the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And I've been involved with them since I started in college. Actually, here at, well, not here, I'm sorry, I grew up in Wisconsin, and so I started college at Marquette University there in the 70s. Then I went off to Arizona, got an engineering degree. 77, moved out here, started work at McDonnell Douglas in 77, and eventually got a master's here at WashU in electrical engineering. Worked for McDonnell Douglas from 77 through the mid-90s, not all of it in St. Louis. Here in St. Louis through 92. I know I wanted to get involved in space engineering, and that's how they hired me. And some of the guys in Mac's old team were the ones who hired me, and I worked for them. And
we don't know what Mac's old team is.
Oh, this group? Okay. Seriously, you don't? Do I need to explain what that is for this group? Okay. Mac's old team is engineers from McDonnell Douglas here who worked on the Mercury and Gemini program in the 60s. And then after that, they became managers and senior engineers. And as a young engineer in the 70s, I was working for those folks. And they're still around now doing outreach.
They get together about once a month for lunch.
Yeah, and they do a lot of outreach, and I've run into them on some of my past visits here, and I think that's really cool. Anyway, so I come out here. I know I want to get involved in engineering, and I was hired here to work on the space programs they had at the time. And I had a generic electrical engineering degree. And, the first program I worked on, they were developing a new kind of a battery, electrical storage battery. And they said, hey, you want to help learn all about these batteries? We need a new guy to this is a new technology. We want somebody to come and kind of follow this through and be our expert. Sure, why not? So serendipitous, that became my whole career. From then on, I was a space power engineer, and that's what I spent my career doing. And it wasn't by design, it was an opportunity that said, you want to do this? And you don't say no to that. So again, a career lesson, be open to things, and go in open-minded. I didn't have a specific plan, but this seemed to work out. So that's one thing to keep an eye on. So we worked on a lot of stuff here. You'll see a little more detail. In the mid-90s, it's kind of a downsizing, a downturn in the aerospace industry, and a lot of layoffs here. But McDonnell Douglas had an office, what they call the Engineering Services Division, that was doing support work for NASA Goddard in Maryland. So we moved the family to Maryland. That was real interesting. That got me, because they were getting out of the space business here. You know, it was all airplanes and missiles. And so if I want to stay in the space business, I had to relocate. So I went off to Maryland and got to know all the NASA people because we were working with them. So that was a real good thing career-wise. And worked on a number of NASA programs. And we also, some of the other McDonnell divisions started working with commercial companies on a program that Motorola was doing called Iridium. And you may have heard Iridium's in the news lately because they just replaced the constellation that I helped build 20-odd years ago. This is the second generation, so I call it Iridium Next. But the original Iridium, the whole concept was headed up by Motorola, and they hired all the aerospace companies. They had people from everybody helping them on this, including McDonnell Douglas. And by that point, my family, my wife's family, were living in the Phoenix area, and that's where all this work was being done. And it was like, hey, you want to move to Phoenix? Sure, why not? Family, finally get to live near family. So after a lot of that, so then I relocated out to Arizona, been there ever since. And when Iridium was finished, I was still a contractor to Motorola working on Iridium. By then we were Boeing. But when that wound up, I followed a lot of people who went to another local company called Spectrum Astro, and this is in 2000. And they were making small satellites, moving up into larger satellites, and they needed a power system guy to be the lead power system engineer on one of their NASA programs. So I left Boeing and went over to Spectrum Astro. So those are really the only two employers I've had my whole career. I know today that's kind of unusual to have just maybe one or two employers your whole career. You jump around a lot. But you know, with this last one, I've had 6 different badges and I haven't moved my desk. You know, we started out Spectrum Astro, they sold that to GD, and then GD moved us to a different GD division, same building. Then Orbital Sciences bought the space business from GD, and then they merged with Orbital ATK, and now just this year we're part of Northrop Grumman. So, and then I retired and said that's enough of this nonsense.
Congratulations, look at all those companies.
That's right, I got a whole collection of badges. Anyway, so that's a big overview. So I've worked on a bunch of satellite, and I even worked on some launch vehicles for a while, and I retired last fall. So that's the big overview. So we'll go into some more detail. So how did I get up into this? Well, this is actually a picture taken July 20th, 1969, off my TV back in Wisconsin, you know, the first step on the moon. And, you know, growing up as a youngster in the 60s with the nuns rolling the TVs into the classroom so we can watch John Glenn go up, you know, you get kind of inspired by that as a kid with a supportive family who was, you know, into education and science and technology. And like, I want to do this, you know, that and Star Trek said, I want to go there. I want to make this happen. So this is the kind of stuff that got me going. By the time I got in high school, I was actually at my cousin's house at a birthday party, my older cousin, who I thought was the coolest guy ever. And because he had all these records, you know, on the record player. And anyway, we were in his bedroom, and he had all these pictures of space probes and rockets. And I said, where'd you get all this NASA stuff from? He says, well, I'm doing a report for my high school science class, and I wrote to NASA, and they'll send you all this stuff free. And it's like, really? Give me that address, man. So you get all this stuff. And I still have all this. In fact, I've been cataloging it because I want to get rid of some of it. But you can get all these photos and educational publications, and it was just a gold mine of information. And this is back in the 60s and early 70s. And you know, it really gets you going and inspired. And of course, we launched model rockets out in the field next to the school and stuff like that. So anyway, I got through high school and got into an engineering program, initially at Marquette, and then after 1 year living at home, going to college, figured, you know, you don't really want to live at home and go to college, so let's go someplace further away. And I transferred after 1 year at Marquette, went out to the University of Arizona, because they had relatively low out-of-state tuition, and they had a nice engineering program. They had undergraduate astronomy. I figured, now my whole deal career-wise was, I'm not smart enough to be an astronomer, okay, or astrophysicist. And there are not many jobs there. But I get an engineering degree, and I can go build stuff that goes on satellites. So I said, I know, I'll take some undergraduate astronomy courses so I have a basic understanding of what these satellites are looking at. then I can help design and build the instruments that they put on the satellites and get really involved in space exploration that way. So that was my plan. And, but right from the get-go, and this is back in '72 when I was a freshman in Milwaukee, the student branch, AIAA, they had a display at an air show. So, you know, I was already like 18 years old doing outreach, you know, and been doing it ever since. Look at me, here I am today. And artsy stuff, you know, I painted this mural in one of the study rooms on the campus there. So you can kind of see I'm also into the crafty creative thing on the side. But anyway, so I was chairman of the student branch one year. You know, like I say, take advantage of leadership roles early in your career, you know, while you're still a student. Volunteer for stuff. There's student organizations. Go ahead and be an officer, be a leader, go out and practice talking to the public and things like that. But again, you know, I always like building models and painting. This is another example. This is just a pen and pencil ink on poster paper I did way long time ago with some imaginative concepts, kind of inspired by 2001 a little bit. But again, this is a big mural just painted on a wall. So things like that. And then, again, career-wise, I had an opportunity. One of the things, reasons I went to Arizona, and a lot of schools have this, was they had a good co-op program. And I found out that they had a connection with a co-op program at NASA Marshall Space Center in Alabama. And so you could sign up to work at, you know, co-op is where you take a semester off of classes and you go work someplace. And it's usually not necessarily in the same city as where the school is. And since I wasn't from Arizona anyway, I could go anywhere. So
Do they still have those? I know
they still do co-ops, yeah. A lot of times it's called internships now. These are paid jobs. I know at the companies I've worked at, we have they call them student interns. I don't know if they call them co-ops so much anymore, but there's similar programs going on today. I know that because I've had, you know, college students working with me at Orbital on programs. And then after they graduate, we usually hire them because, you know, they've already got indoctrinated in the system and what you're working on, and you screen them while they're still before they graduate, and then you say this guy, once he gets his degree, you know, hire him or not. So anyway, so I did that back in the 70s, 3 semesters at NASA Marshall. So here I am, space geek already, 19 years old, and I got a NASA badge. You know, I was a teenage NASA scientist, rocket engineer, you know. How cool is that? And at the time, I was at NASA Huntsville when they launched Skylab in '73. And that is where they had the Skylab trainer that's now in the museum there. And so this picture of me a few years ago, when my hair is still, it was never thick, but it's a little short today. Yeah, super blonde. Well, you know, you're outdoors a little more. Anyway, in the Skylab trainer back in about '74, and I've got a picture of myself in the same Skylab trainer taken a couple of years ago when I had a chance to visit the museum, and it's pretty interesting. Anyway, so like I said, I wanted to get an electrical engineering degree so I could work on satellites. And I was able to take astronomy courses so I could kind of understand all the science behind it. And I think I've kind of told you that last part. So this is where my career is going. And while we were in summer of '75 was Apollo-Soyuz, and that was my 3rd term in Huntsville. And so some of the co-ops, we went to Florida, we got passes to go see this launch up close. So I saw the last Saturn launch. Saturn 1B was the last Saturn launched on Apollo-Soyuz. So this was the first launch I had seen, and very fortunate to do that. So got through college. First job was here with McDonnell Douglas. I worked on what was called the modular power subsystem, where Dean Purdy was the program manager. Worked for a number of people there. Worked on shuttle aft propulsion system. I also worked on a lot of studies and R&D and what we called IRAD programs and various technology studies. And again, I never planned to do space. I don't know what I was going to do. I thought I might do, optics, because I had some optical background too, or instruments, or some kind of sensors or things like that. Because it was just a generic electrical. I didn't really specialize in anything like digital circuits or software or anything. But power systems worked out really well for me. And again, it was just an opportunity, and I grabbed it. And again, that thing is one of the lessons I'm going to point out here later on as we go along, career-wise. And of course, always a good idea to continue your education. So I got a master's at Wash U here a few years after that, company paid for, which is still standard. So a lot of companies will still pay for your advanced degree. And that's always a plus. It always looks good on your resume and is practical. So working here at McDonnell Douglas in the late 70s and into the 80s was really cool, because this is where they did Skylab. I don't know if anybody, is this thing still here? The 30-foot chamber, whatever the hell this 24-foot chamber?
I just found out last week it's still there.
It's still there?
Yeah, and it was dormant for a long time, and then they refurbished it and they're using it again. I don't know what.
I'd be curious what they'd be using it for, because it was built for Gemini.
I'll tell you.
It was built for Gemini, and there's pictures with the Gemini capsule sitting on its tail in here, and the Skylab airlock was built here in St. Louis, and it tested in there as well, and it barely fit. But I remember, you can go to Building 102? I think so, yeah. And you can just walk around here. And I remember as a young engineer, I'm walking around where astronauts walk, not 10 years prior, And I'm using the same urinal those astronauts use. It was just awesome, as a young guy into this stuff, just to be in the same room where they did all this cool, it was just so inspirational as a kid. So we were very fortunate to do that. One of the programs I worked on, we didn't win this, but it was, the very first one was what turned out to be the Galileo probe, the Galileo Jupiter orbiter, and they had an entry probe. And McDonnell, with all their re-entry vehicle technology and history with Mercury Gemini and other programs, bid on that. We didn't win it, but we did some neat work on it. And I got to play around with that a little bit. Again, I supported the shuttle program. The aft propulsion pods were built here. And I worked on that many long, dull hours, erasing drawings and moving.
Walk around and watch you build those.
Well, you could watch them build. You could watch them build F-4 Phantoms too, and Harriers, and just walk around the assembly building there. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Anyway, so we did, my wife and I, and actually another guy who's very involved, apparently still in AIAA and the museum, Bob Willow.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was with us at this launch. He was a family friend back in the day, and he came with my wife and I, and we camped on the beach and got up a couple times, and we saw the first shuttle launch. That's my photo. The most fun program I worked on, I remember one of the managers said, "Hey, Mike, come on over here. We want a special assignment for you." And it was the National Aerospace plane. It was highly classified at the time. I mean, the program was existing, but exactly what it was doing and how it worked was highly classified. And it was basically single stage to orbit, runway to orbit. X-30, hypersonic, very complex propulsion, advanced materials. Well, what the problem was, it was too hard. And it still is too hard. Single stage to orbit is very difficult. And they did do some advances in aerodynamics and some materials, but to put the whole thing together in the scale that was needed, once they spent some time and a lot of money, they just realized this is not doable, at least with the technology of the early 1980s. And it's still not doable in this form. There are people making some progress, but 20, 30, 30 odd years later, we still don't have this. I got a whole talk on whatever happened to single stage to orbit. Maybe you invite me back sometime, I'll give you that talk. But it's still a dream. But that was a fun program because I was working with, anybody here named Paul Sizz? Remember him?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Paul. He passed away a few years back. But he was a great guy. We would have him as speakers back in the 80s.
He came to my school every year for 15 years.
He was awesome. Mr. Hypersonic, I would call him. He had so many, slush hydrogen, lace. I mean, he was so creative and had so many neat ideas for hypersonics and stuff like that. People like him, and there are other folks, because he worked with the airplane guys and the space guys And I was working on, most airplanes get their secondary power off of rotating machinery from the turbine engines. Well, there are no turbine engines on this thing, so where do you get your power? So me and one of the older engineers, we're trying to figure out, we're going to use fuel cells, batteries, what kind of exotic power source, because you need a lot of power for this kind of vehicle. And we had a lot of fun with that. So that was a fun program just because of the nature of the program and the kind of people and the technology you get to hang around with. So anyway, by the early 90s, things kind of dried up here, so I took a transfer out to Goddard, worked on some NASA satellites, including something called TOMS EP. TOMS is Total Ozone Monitoring Satellite, Earth Probe, and did that for about 4 years. And then, I guess I mentioned earlier, came out to Arizona to work on the original Iridium constellation with Motorola. And that was a fun program because they built and launched like almost 100 satellites in like 3 years. And there was one time, there was a 1 week period where they launched, I think, 12 satellites from 3 continents on 3 different launch vehicles. And, I'm part of the team, placing bets on how many are going to come off the rocket as a rock that you can't even talk to. But they all worked. We had very few rocks. Anyway, so when that program wrapped up, a lot of people from that team went off to what was Spectrum Astro and changed names a few times. And I worked on a couple of, these are gamma ray low Earth orbiting satellites, Swift and GLAST. Some satellites that we work with Missile Defense Agency to try to track and detect ballistic missiles. We never built those because the technology was, again, a technology that's too difficult. But those are fun programs. Those are always, sometimes the most fun programs are the ones you never build because you're trying to do something that turns out to be impossible or too expensive to make it possible. You could have poured more money into it and maybe it would have worked, but somebody saw the writing on the wall that, this program ain't going anywhere. We're just going to stop here. A couple of Landsat satellites. Then the last one I helped get up was ISAT-2, which was launched last October. I got to see that launch and help get that bird off the ground. That was the last 18 years of my career since 2000, and I had a lot of fun. I got to be the lead guy for the power system, work with some of the younger engineers. We design, build, test. I was basically the architect for all the big high-power satellites they're doing now in our Gilbert office. And so when I became Medicare eligible, I said, enough guys, see ya, this is long enough. So just a couple pictures of some of the satellites. So that's the career part. So here, part 2. Space advocate. So now we talk about National Space Society and stuff. So in the early 80s, working on this Galileo probe, a bunch of congressmen said, we don't need all this stuff and we don't spend money on this. So, they were going to cancel the Galileo probe, and we were still bidding on it. And not just because we were bidding on it, it was a business issue, but it was because there was this big gap. There was a period of time, 70s and 80s, was like 11 years between the U.S. launching a planetary spacecraft. Nowadays it's like every couple months we're launching something to Mars or an asteroid. Back in the 70s, 80s, there was, I think, an 11-year period we did not launch a single probe out of Earth orbit. And that was just shameful. And so that got a lot of people in the advocacy community kind of worked up to do something about it, to try to be a little more proactive in selling space to the public and to Congress. And from my perspective, I said, look, get the people, get the voters to understand why this is important. They will then elect the right people, rather than trying to go directly to Congress and twist somebody's arm who has no interest at all, but get the public to elect the right people in the beginning, to begin with. So that was kind of my take on it. So I was working on the public outreach, and people who were better at talking to Congress critters, I would let that be to them. So anyway, there was a need to do this promoting. And one of the examples that started in the early 80s was a thing in the summer on the Apollo anniversary week called Space Week. And they figured, school's out, kids can come to things, we can have an event, we can publicize, again, to talk about an official anniversary or holiday commemorating the Apollo initial moon landing in July. That was going on back in the 80s called Space Week. So I thought, well, maybe we should be doing that here in St. Louis. So again, I mentioned I started doing some outreach with AIAA. I had talked to some of the early L5 Society founders, because that was started in Tucson back in the 70s when I was in school there. And at the time, when I talked to those people, they would say, yeah, we can start building space colonies in 1980 when the space shuttle starts launching. And I was like, you guys know nothing about how this works. You know, I appreciated their enthusiasm, but practical, it was like, yeah, we build space colonies next year. So I kind of didn't really get real serious with L5 because AIAA was a little more down to earth, or although they're airplanes, they're not down to earth, but it was more realistic. So we got going with stuff. Again, this is another example of a display in
Wait, who's in that picture?
these are people. This is in Arizona. This is Arizona, so you wouldn't recognize these pictures.
Sorry.
But it was typical of, you know, mid 70s. There's a couple of students. So what we did in here, there was an L5 group on campus back in '81. They were trying to get a little organized on campus. They weren't having much luck. So Irv Bauman, another one of my buddies, and I know Philip was involved early on. We restarted the group, and Irv and I got a new charter paperwork from from L5 headquarters. There wasn't the merger at the time. So our very first meeting as an L5 chapter, that wasn't necessarily associated with the Wash Youth Student Chapter, was in May of '82, featuring McDonnell Douglas astronaut Charlie Walker. Charlie, if you don't know, he flew 3 times on a space shuttle operating a McDonnell Douglas electrophoresis pharmaceutical processing plant. And he sat a few desks down from me for quite a long time. And so I've known him ever since, and I just saw him a week or 2 ago, and he'll be out in Bonne Terre for the museum thing this weekend. So he and I go back that far. And so that's how all this started here in St. Louis. And then so we did Space Week in '82, and these kinds of things. We would get speakers from local, from out of town, astronauts, and work with the Science Center. A lot of work put into public outreach and a long series of events trying to generate publicity. And, you know, small groups, you know, we'd get in the paper. The Star Trek movies were coming out. There was expenses involved in putting on these events, so we'd try to arrange fundraisers with movie premieres to have special activities around them, and we'd get a cut of that, and we had connections that enabled us to do that. All sorts of interesting things. We got billboards out at Forest Park for Space Week. So 25 years, I don't know if the 25 years since Apollo, or this was like '83 or something. I forget when that would be then. There's a familiar face.
Stand up.
There's Bob. Hey! The beard is,
So Bob used to have dark hair.
yeah.
Wait a minute, let me get a picture of that.
The highly advanced audio-visual equipment we had at the time. A nice flyer. You probably still got that T-shirt on under that sweater, right?
No. Oh, I should have brought. Yeah, it's packed away.
I got mine somewhere.
Yeah.
And then we would do stuff at, they still have the VP Fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did exhibits at the VP Fair. We'd sell, yeah, this is downtown. We'd sell patches and laser prints, the space shuttle stuff. And to try to make money to, that's Gene Heitman, passed away some years ago. I forget who the other 2 gentlemen are.
Okay, I just wondered who they were.
But that's Gene. Gene was one of the honchos that really helped us be successful in those early days. So we would do stuff like this. We would do library displays. We did a mirror watch. This was something the NSS headquarters was promoting. The idea was you get press releases and you tell people, hey, look, there'll be a space station flying overhead. Go out and you can see a space station fly overhead. Of course, the thing was it was a Russian space station, and at the time we didn't even have a plan for one. So it was a whole PR kind of a thing to raise awareness of where's our space station, you know? In fact, McDonnell Douglas had this very famous 30-second spot called "Shouldn't We Be There Too?" Anybody remember that? I've got that on a video somewhere. I have to show that sometime. It's really cool. It was very well done. So we did stuff like that. You know, I got noticed at work. Front page of the company newsletter one week. It's like, but sometimes, you know, this is not to your advantage, because they'll notice you while you're on the phone, while you are doing all this stuff for these groups, while you're supposed to be, you know, working on your technical, you know, they give you some leeway, but you got to watch your step, you know, and you got to be on good graces with your managers to allow you to take a little time to do this kind of stuff. And even today, that's really difficult. Today, I find it's difficult because, you know, you're encouraged to help do STEM outreach now, is the thing. Okay, go to talk to a school, but it's all during work hours. And most companies, you got to take your own time off to go talk to a school on behalf of your company. You know, they're not going to give you an overhead charge number to go off at 2 in the afternoon to go give a presentation at some junior high. They will? That's good. That's good to hear, because none of my companies since then would do that. It's unfortunate. They should. Oh, absolutely they should. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle. And if companies want to have an educated workforce, they need to support this stuff a little better. There's too much. But anyway, they noticed, this is what, August 1990. So they kind of noticed. But you see, notice another thing, by then, it's McDonnell Missile Systems Company. They were getting out of the space business, and within 2 years, I was out of there. So anyway, so for a space advocacy perspective, you know, that was the 80s, you know. What is it today? What's the story? Does this even make sense? Does it really need organized groups to do this kind of stuff? Does local push from the bottom, educating the public, even matter? I'm not sure it does, strategically. There's no way to measure it, really. I don't know that talking to random groups at a Space Week or Space Up or Yuri's Night is really going to swing votes in D.C. But at the micro level, you know, we spent a lot of time talking to students at schools. We did a lot of one-on-one conversations with people. You have no way of knowing, did any of those kids go on to become an engineer or a scientist or somehow involved in technology? Maybe, maybe not. If nothing else, that much probably made a difference somewhere. You don't know. But I think that level is probably more important than swinging votes by trying to talk to the public and putting things in the newspaper. I don't know. It was a lot of work. Did it make a difference? I don't know. Actually, I wrote a book about the whole adventure. I wrote a book about it. So come see me later. I got some flyers how to get a book copy. This whole thing is written up. So again, moved to Arizona, and mostly there wasn't at the time any kind of NSS group out there. So I focused a lot on STEM stuff and special events. There was a science festival kind of going on there. I helped work with them for a few years. And then about 8-9 years ago, there was a little chapter of the National Space Society, so I tried to help them getting going, and I was president of that for a few years. And I'm still working with both them and AIAA for outreach in the Phoenix area. And it's mostly social. We're not really big enough to try to do any large events. What we find is you know, what still works, you know, and library displays, things like Yuri's Night, which is on April 12th, celebrating Yuri Gagarin's first manned flight, which also happens to be the anniversary of the first space shuttle flight. So it's sort of a global celebration of space flight, and it's sort of a social thing. There are some cities that put on huge events, but those are pretty unusual. They're not real common to have a big event like that. There's still Space Week now. There's kind of a Space Week thing that goes on in the fall. There's a thing called Space Up. It's sort of a meetup unconference where I thought we're doing one in Phoenix next weekend. You can go to a school science night and promote space stuff. So you do a lot of STEM outreach. I think is maybe the most useful thing one can do to get exposure to your group and get your message out to parents and teachers. Will see that, and you make some connections there. And you do things like these, what I call these gravity jugs. Yeah, you're familiar with those. You fill them up with water to see how much something feels like on Moon, Mars, and Earth. We got an air rocket there. This was a Girl Scout Science Day at a little museum we did once back in Phoenix. So that's really good. And again, since you're usually a small group, and this applies to other kind of activities, other kind of outreach, or public outreach. If you're a small group, try to find somebody who's already doing something and kind of tag on with them. You don't have to be the lead on everything, but it gives you an opportunity to get some exposure, even being part of something bigger. And then the bigger group will take the lead, but then they'll learn about you. You will learn to work with them. And they will do the publicity and the marketing and the facilities, which is usually expensive and takes a lot of expertise.
But Mike, we have the St. Louis Space Frontier right here in St.
Mhm.
Louis, so you don't have to look for a small group or form your own group. We have
Hey,
a wonderful group.
There you go. There you go. But, some cities don't have, like I say, in Phoenix, we don't really have a very large group. So we try to tag on to something else that's going on. And even here, back in the 80s, we would work with the planetarium and let their staff do it. An example we have in Arizona is the university, Arizona State University, does a lot of cool outreach. They have a really neat planetary science department with a lot of neat stuff going on. And they do a lot of stuff, and we sometimes will kind of tag on. In fact, they had an event, oh, look at that guy. They had an event for the New Horizons flyby a few years ago. And I knew some of the people organizing it, and I said, hey, can I have a few minutes? And they gave me a few minutes, and in fact, while they had the NASA video feed going, they were talking all this space jargon, and I would kind of provide color commentary, say, oh, that means this is happening, and that means this is happening, because it's the same jargon they use for any kind of spacecraft mission, and I was able to help with that. So you can find opportunities that some other group is doing, but you get up there and now you've provided some expertise in an area that they might not have on hand. So you got to look for those opportunities for those kind of outreach. One thing I find, and maybe this is just me personally, for your group to be successful, the attendees have to be having fun at the meetings. And I'm going to get into my next thing here if I don't just keep babbling slowly. And that's the model building. And I've been with a number of clubs that build scale models, and some of the clubs kind of don't do too well. And the ones that are most successful are when somebody comes to a meeting and they have a good time. Then they want to come back. If you go and it's boring and dull and no one pays attention to you, if you're a new person, they're not going to come back. So you got to make sure they're welcome, and otherwise it's just the dedicated space fans are going to come. And you don't want that. You want to expand and have new people become passionate. You want to help them find their passion and become it. You want to inspire them. And the problem a lot of groups are facing lately is, well, people are finding their associations and interests met online. Yeah, you got a Facebook group, you got chat rooms, you got email discussion groups. And you certainly take advantage of that, and you certainly learn a lot and meet a lot of people there, but there's no substitution for face-to-face get-togethers like this entity here is doing. There's some things you just don't get online. You need face-to-face interaction, you need to mingle with people, you need to get up off your butt and go do things and go talk to people and hands-on stuff, and the internet will not provide that for you. It might provide the resources and the tools, but you still have to get out and do face-to-face. And that's still a challenge because a lot of groups are having trouble with that. I'm going to go through this really quickly, kind of comparing, well, what happened in the 80s and where are we now in terms of promoting space exploration? So in the 80s, it was the space shuttle was just getting started. Well, now it's retired, okay? U.S. space policy was wildly optimistic. Oh, moon bases, Mars, space manufacturing, Earth resources, space station. Mir was up there, and we were still arguing about freedom and this and that and the tri-hull and who knows what. Well, we built one. It's not bad. It's pretty good. I'm not sure what we're doing with it, but we built it. There was no planetary launches for an 11-year period back in the 70s and 80s. Nothing. And now we got Mars rovers stirring up the dust, Saturn orbiters, Pluto, Kuiper belt, comet landers, all sorts of stuff. I mean, we've done a lot since the 80s. We've come a long way in getting some of this stuff turned around. Innovation driver back then was Star Wars stuff, missile defense. Today, it's the new space guys. Entrepreneurs that can do whatever the heck they want because it's their money. That didn't exist, and that wasn't even predicted in the 80s. Tools for activists, newsletters. We would type up newsletters, we'd make pretty newsletters, we'd mail them out to everybody, we'd get other clubs' newsletters, we'd exchange ideas there. Of course, now it's all on the internet. We would go to meetings to hang out and talk and learn things. Internet. But the biggest challenge in really getting space real is articulating why it's important. Explain to people in a believable way why this is important to you to support this. That hasn't changed. That's still our biggest challenge. And I don't have an answer. I don't have a good answer because,
I want to go, get it low enough.
I want to go, but that's not a good enough answer. No one's going to spend billions to develop. Well, if Bezos and Musk have their way, maybe they will. All right, part three. Part three, the crafter part, okay? I designed spacecraft as an engineer, but my hobby is building models. I got a case full of rockets and airplanes, stuff like that, because I just eat this stuff up. I got to do it 24/7. And so what I call it is, it's basically, this is how I see it. It's not just because I like building things, but I do, but it's part of being an engineer. Everybody, and for me, I'm a creative person. I got to have my creative outlets. I was fortunate I could be an engineer, that's a creative outlet. I could do artsy things, that's a creative outlet. I can talk to you here today, that's a creative outlet. I can build models, that's a creative outlet. But for people who like space stuff, and you want to be part of the program, you want to have a part in front of you. So a lot of people, you do artwork, books, models. Why not? Models are good. Obviously you can't have real spacecraft, but you can build a model or buy a model that's built up. But the thing is, it's more rewarding to build it yourself than to buy one, and it's cheaper too than built up. So that's how you get into the hobby. Now the problem is a lot of model kits, they're not that many, and they're not that good, and if you're really geeky, they're not that accurate. And Mr. Eastman here could tell you all about not that accurate. And here, thank you Internet for helping us all get together and figure out all this stuff. And working in the industry gave me access to some documentation, especially here, so I got a lot of Mercury and Gemini stuff, which are still my favorite programs. And, you got all these old kits, and some are good and some are just not all there. Things like, but after Apollo, there weren't many kits. The Apollo-Soyuz kit and some space shuttle kits, and that's about it. No Mars rovers, no satellites. There's still nothing on the books for the new Orion or the Falcons or Dragon ships or any of Bezos's new Shepherds. You can get stuff that are kind of one-offs that maybe the guy had a license to do, but there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff. It's a licensing problem, and it's also a problem that. Heck, Revell doesn't hardly exist anymore. Revell USA, that made these old kits, they have 2 employees in Chicago. That's it. Revell of Germany is, anytime you're going to get a Revell, it's out of Germany now. And so the industry has changed, and they don't perceive there's any interest in this anymore. So you got to go another route. So what to do? Well, I won't even get into 3D printing because that's where you can get a lot of this stuff nowadays. But you're going to have to build it yourself. Or you can take a kit and then make it more accurate. So I started networking people together. Even before the internet, I would mail out this thing I call the Scale Spacecraft newsletter. I had a bunch of contacts, and I just tried to expand my network. So again, networking, do it yourself. Find your initial set of contacts, send them, now you can send them an email or a website or something, and just start expanding your network. And in the 80s, it was by mail with newsletters still. And then I started doing seminars on this. IPMS is the International Plastic Modeler Society. They have an annual get-together with a lot of seminars and talks and stuff. So I would start talking about the subject and then promoting. What I would start doing is writing up books on building these models. I call it Space in Miniature. And so I take these books, take this reference material, describe how to take a kit and make it more accurate, or maybe how I scratch built something, or how somebody else scratch built something. Mr. Eastman helped me with one of the books on Gemini. I've had some people, other contributors, and I self-publish these, and over time when the hard copies are gone, I sell PDFs. And I make a little money to subsidize my hobby, okay? And a lot of it's done online. So you can find ways to monetize your hobby enough. You're not going to live off it, but it'll pay for itself. And so the idea is, I find this niche, because there's nothing out there. There's not a lot out, like I said, there's not a lot of kits. There's not a lot of good reference material. You know, and people see this stuff and say, oh, this is great, because I got the drawings, I got the color, I got how each mission differed. And you do their research for them and you distill it for a model builder, they'll eat that up. And for a few bucks, they'll sell it and they'll love it. And we're looking at things like, you know, on the Revell model kit of Gemini, see it's got this curvy scallop in the window? Well, that was because the mock-up, the engineering model had a curvy scallop, but the flight versions didn't have a curvy scallop. So as space detail freaks, we have to fix that on our models. So it's stuff like that that we're looking at. Also, maybe you want to build something that there's no kit. So you have to scratch build it. And that means you got to find reference material, come up with some drawings. Older programs, there's not a lot out there. Newer stuff, it's proprietary or they don't want to give you it. Try to find a drawing from NASA or JPL of the Curiosity Mars rover. No. I made a model, I had to make my own. So what you do, you start with a few dimensions, maybe a couple of pieces of it, and a lot of photos, and you make your own drawings. And then nowadays, you can make your own 3D models and print a model on a 3D printer. So this is back in the 70s. I built a Viking model. I had some drawings, and I assembled it all and made my own drawings, and then built this up out of bits of plastic sheet and structural materials and a ping pong ball and bits of aluminum tubing and vacuum formed Humbrol paint lids, and then you get this. So, you know, that's what you can do. A few other scratch build projects, a little Cosmos vehicle, which looks a lot like the Dream Chaser, because it is. It's the same shape that the Russians flew in the 80s. And they've kind of refined it a bit, but that's Dream Chaser, really. Good old DCX. I got a hold of, again, because I worked at McDonald's, somebody on the program I asked around, and they sent me some drawings, and they said, yeah, you can use these. So I built a model. That just
Vertical landing rocket.
yeah, that kind of a precursor to what Musk is doing with Falcon.
Bezos.
A lot of the same people who worked that are working at those two companies, at Blue Origin and SpaceX. Way back when, I made a Skylab model, and that was all scratch built.
You still have it.
I still have that. I still have all these things. They're still hanging in there. This proves that super glue will not fall apart after 40 years. So these are piano wire, steel wire, cut and just super glued together, and it is not falling apart.
How
in
many years?
1974. I know I can't count that far back. Built this while I was in Huntsville, because I had the real thing there as a reference. Or you can take a kit and then add a bunch of detail. This is the monogram kit with a whole bunch of stuff added and corrected. You know, new thrust deflectors. I opened up the hatch. I added the ALSEP panel, the MESA panel. Bunch of other things on there. So you take that, but again, it takes the research, but I got it all documented in my book. So I explain how I did this in my book, and I got drawings and reviews. And so for model builders, I've got this all distilled for them. Other projects, there is a simple snap-together mirror kit, but there's also a guy in the Czech Republic who sells what they call a photo etch brass solar panels and antennas, and makes it a lot more realistic looking. And so that's got all sorts of stuff added to this little mirror model, and I was real happy with how that came out. This is completely scratch built. It's only like yay big, but it's all scratch built, making 6 identical spoked wire wheel wheels was not fun. But, you know, that's something you can do. This is just, these are both kits with a few things added, but just fun things to do. Oh, and this is a thing a project I just finished recently. Again, I'm really kind of a Gemini freak. And in digging through the archives, back in the early 80s, you know, they were getting out of space business. Skylab was done, the shuttle was designed and built, and they were getting less and less space stuff. So the guys I was working with, it's like they would have what they call tidy time. It's like, okay, guys, see all these filing cabinets? We need to empty like a third of them. So these old projects that are done, just pitch it. Here's a bunch of barrels. Fill them up tonight, and we'll clean them out. So when they were all done, I would go diving in there and just, what can I salvage? And I would come up with all sorts of stuff that they were throwing out. And that's where these two drawings came from. It's called the Winged Gemini. And those are the only drawings in existence anywhere that anybody knows about that program. Only because I pulled them out of the trash. If you see those online anywhere, it's because I shared them with people. But that's where they came from. Also, there were things like, so these are all the different variants of Gemini. The two on the left actually flew, okay? But the Regalo wing, they never came around with that. They had something called Big G. Yes. Big G, there's a model of that. Of course, Manned Orbiting Lab with the reconnaissance camera inside. That's a kit. There was also some studies they did in the 60s. There were two sets of studies. One was early on where they were concerned that Apollo was having so many problems like in 62, 63 that they wanted to consider what alternates do we have to beat the Russians to the moon. So they looked at Gemini lunar applications. Okay, very interesting stuff. Then that's not going to go. So after the Apollo fire in 67, they thought, what if something bad happens to these guys on the moon? And how could we send like a rescue mission? But we really don't want to use another Apollo because the same bad thing might happen. So we need something that's completely separate from Apollo for a lunar rescue mission. So McDonnell did a lunar rescue Gemini study with several different variants. It's full drawings and concepts and stuff. And they actually built a little scale model. And I've got those pictures pulled out of the trash of the scale model they built of the Lunar Rescue Gemini. And it's sort of a cutaway with a lot of clear parts. You can see all the tanks and everything. So this is the Lunar Rescue Gemini as it would appear had they actually built it. With all the foil. And their model didn't have, and the drawings didn't have ladders, because I don't know how you get up there without some ladders. So anyway, so this is what I call my Gemini series of mostly what-ifs that never were built. And then the Winged Gemini, of course. So there's actually another one, but I didn't bring it here. That's a whole nother story. It wasn't a McDonnell study, so it doesn't really count. But anyway, so this is my hobby, you know. So this is, to me, model building is really fulfilling because now you've actually created it yourself. And now you have your personal space program, you know, in your little hobby room or wherever you display your stuff. You know, you're a rocket engineer, only a little smaller and simpler. You're taking art combined with the technology and the history, because you've got to study this stuff to find out what it is you're building a model of. And you kind of feel more connected to it in one way or another, you know. So you're more than just an observer reading about it. You're kind of a participant, even in a small way. You know, that by building this little monument to the space exploration, you're supporting it and proclaiming your passion about it to whoever happens to come by. So again, this is getting your passion for your interests in all aspects of your life as much as you want. So kind of to wrap up, and this kind of goes all across hobbies, advocacy, mostly career though. Make a long-term plan. You know, my long-term plan was to get an electrical engineering degree, learn about astronomy and space stuff, and get in that industry. Now, it worked out okay, but I didn't plan to be a power system guy when I was in college. But you keep your eyes open and you find an opportunity. You know, it may not turn out exactly like you need. There are also a lot of things going on things that you can't control. We were still here bidding on satellites and a bunch of programs, and when Challenger blew up, all that changed. All that changed. You got no control over that. There was another one we were bidding on, and we did not get the contract. So they kind of stopped trying after that point. They realized, you know, this division was just too expensive to build satellites and be competitive with TRW and Lockheed and everybody else was building satellites. So again, not in your control, but it affects your career path. So you need to have kind of a backup plan or a plan B or some flexibility. Things are going to change. You know, nothing stays constant. That ain't McDonnell Douglas out there anymore. It's got a big Boeing logo on the building, okay? Things stay the same. Like I said, my experience, I've been through 6 different badges doing the same job for the same organization. Things are going to change. So don't expect it to go on forever. And of course, this is looking back 40 years. Be open-minded to those changes. Network. That's why a group like AIAA or whatever profession you're in, join a professional organization, network, find people who are doing similar work at other companies. Find out who those companies are and have those contacts ready when your company goes down the tubes. Because it could happen. You know, and things, or if your company doesn't go down, your program may go down the tubes. You know, one of the divisions in Arizona where I work was very involved in missile defense. When they changed administrations in Washington, the new guy said, "We don't want to spend all the money on missile defense, so we're gonna stop these programs." And suddenly had to lay off 1,000 people. Now, over 6 years, they brought them all back, but you know, stuff like that is out of your control. So you need to have Plan B. Company's still there, they're doing great, but you know, things happen, things shift, things change. Be flexible, be ready for change, because change will happen. And mix in your career interests with your personal interests. For a lot of people, it's not the same. A lot of people come home, they don't want to do hobby stuff that's like what they do at work. Some crazies like me, we do. We just eat it up 24/7.
I was wondering how you found time to do all that.
Well, it's been over a long time, you know. I don't watch a lot of TV. How about that? I don't watch a lot of TV. I've never seen a full episode of Seinfeld, okay? So I don't watch TV, you know? I mean, I see all these people on various TV shows. I have no idea who these people are, because I don't watch television, very little television. So that's how I find time for all this stuff. I'll have music playing in the background when I'm working on my models or working on my websites or working on my books. I'll listen to music. I can do that while I'm doing this. I don't watch television. It's just a waste of time, at least for me. Be passionate about what your core beliefs are. Stick with it, and your life will be rewarding. And mine has been. I've been very fortunate, and I thank all the people who have supported me. So with that, here's some links. I got my little history. It's called Space City Mike. I got cards here with some of these on them. I got a Twitter feed, MJ Mackowski. Spaceinminiature.com is where all the modeling stuff is, lots of pictures and things. NSS has a pretty slick new website. Just go to nss.org, you'll find it. Our Phoenix chapter has a WordPress site. You can see, I don't post stuff there anymore because I'm not chair, but when I was chair, I would post something like every month, some commentary or something. And thank you for listening, thank you for coming. I can hang around, discuss, answer questions. And I got the story of the history of the St. Louis Space Frontier. This is how to order the book. If you're interested, it's on Amazon, digital or hard copy.